the conversation itself would be something that I would want to be a product, because it's certainly not there, and it's not there in literature. Yes?
It's potentially a racially loaded question, so I'm going to be careful. The background is,
okay.
I teach in one of the things I teach in a prison program where 50% African American, a lot of them want to be entrepreneurs when they come out because that's the only avenue available, et cetera. Their conception, I wonder if you find it as well, is the growth in black-owned enterprises largely dependent upon black communities. In other words, is the black consumer largely what's going to fuel the growth of those businesses?
Well, two things. Two things I'll say. One, usually in those situations, the wealthy, the firms that are operating, it could be the dry cleaners or something like that, that are operating and are actually growing, don't tend to be owned by African Americans. So the first thing I want to say is that many of the successful models in Harlem aren't actually owned by people who live in Harlem. The successful businesses in general that operate in those places have a more general product, right? So it's not like it's all racial marketing, right? I mean, short of hair salons, I mean things that are like culturally specific, hair salons or barbershops, right? And a couple restaurants, which I think fits about 30% of the firms there. Though I guess the recommendation becomes looking at a product that the product appeals to more than just African Americans. Then one can start talking about a growth model. If the product is being designed or the service is being designed and is specifically targeted towards the niche population of African Americans, the density of population helps to cover that. So that's one of the things Greg Fairchild works on, by showing how much wealth is actually sitting in these communities, not on a per household basis or on an individual income basis, right? But if you look at, square mile density, right, and you look at in total of all the incomes that are sitting in there, these poor areas actually have a lot of disposable money sitting in them, right? And so I guess that's like three different answers to your question, right? But have a product that isn't only attractive to African Americans if you want growth, right? But yes, you can. The black consumer is a reliable consumer, and people like folks at Coca-Cola and Pepsi know that too, right? So, yeah.
It seems to me that your model, as you develop it, can be really generalizable. Where my mind was going as you were talking, and somewhere you probably hadn't planned to go, but that's okay. That's when we talk about sustainable development issues, that when you talk about reimagining resources, one of the things that hit me was we're trying to struggle with declining oil, declining natural. Primary resources are going down, much as these communities are communities where there is very little capital there. Maybe there's some generalizability beyond just minority entrepreneurship in terms of the struggle with how do we build stuff out of nothing to build a way forward, and that might be redeployable over into some of the sustainability literature at some point, which would be a really interesting tack.
Thought about that quite a bit, actually.
Okay.
Because I do think that there's a generalizability here. I mean, it worked for Claude Lévi-Strauss, actually. I mean, he changed the whole French Academy to kind of bow down to the anthropological sciences, which was weird, but it happened precisely because of the utility of the logic and its ability to be applied in other places. So, but if an anthropologist, so if Lévi-Strauss has to go and learn the essence of bricolage in Brazil, in a place where you don't have all the trappings of modern civilization and all that stuff, the question is, what becomes the subject that's the equivalent for Lévi-Strauss? What becomes the ethnographic subject, right? If one were going to do that for entrepreneurship, but not just to learn. Obviously, my research is about entrepreneurship, but not just to learn about entrepreneurship, but to learn about human mentality, learn about sources for innovation, poetics. Poetics grows out of this, but to learn about the different ways that we can do it. So really. Bricolage and structuralism are a logical system that then gets extended and transformed into a lot of different places, right? And I didn't go crazy nerdy on the Lévi-Straussian part on this. I just wasn't sure how appropriate that would be. But I really appreciate your question because it's allowed me to say That's really what the whole point is here. And I think that to test bricolage in a contemporary business situation, it's the talented 20th we would have to go to if we want to make the kind of strong claims that Levi Strauss was able to make based on research done in Africa.
With that question, but it just occurred to me that it certainly applies to the work on poverty alleviation in less developed countries. We take it individually, not I put them all together for fun, but on individual communities all over the world, because you have to rethink your view of poverty. You have to redefine those social mindsets, and then you see enormous wealth in the very poorest communities, and how that could be leveraged. I mean, could be leveraged negatively, but also utterly exploited. So yeah, I think that was what I was thinking. This is your thing about sustainability. There's a really lot of generalizability on this. That might be what you might say at the end of your dissertation. The next stage is blah blah blah, because there are lots of next stages from this.
I think that's great. I mean, thanks a lot for that, and I guess I'm running on time. So the last thing I'll say is that I also think that changes. It changes how we might think of what actually constitutes entrepreneurship. I mean, because the entrepreneurship literature is all about Palo Alto and Austin, Texas, Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? And most entrepreneurship doesn't fit any of that. And so hopefully some of what I'm hoping comes out of this is broadening the conversation of what actually constitutes an entrepreneur, right? So that we can look at that kind of stuff. And the models of Muhammad Yunus and folks like that who were smart enough to get past the mainstream literature and go and do pretty much the opposite and do it well. Thank you.
Can I ask you?
Oh, okay, I thought you were signaling me there was time.
We have 3 minutes.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, can I ask you a methodological question?
Sure.
Since you didn't want to talk about Levi Strauss, but I can't talk about anything other than Levi Strauss, so I'll talk about it. But you said with respect to bricolage, that you talked about not adding something new to this. And this is what structuralism tends to do. This is that one of the problems with structuralism, this is the Derridian criticism, for example, is that it freezes things. That one of the problems with the criticisms of Levi Strauss's work that you're talking about in Africa and Brazil is that it freezes those things when in fact they're dynamic. And so the incest prohibition would be the prime example. So I'm violating that being the moderator here talking, for example, right? But so be it. But I wonder in some respects, I guess the question I'm asking is, how are you dealing with this here? Because in a sense, I almost hear that a little bit in the background, and like you want to push and redefine entrepreneurship, but on the other hand, the model that you're using, I think that there are methodological reasons why that could become difficult.
Great question. So now I'll be nerdy about Levi Strauss. So in my readings, I believe there's 2 different Levi Strausses, and some of this is because he spent the large second half of his career writing against all of the people who use the term structuralism and assume that he said things that he didn't actually say. So, and going through that literature, and it all started with a fight he had with Paul Ricoeur, actually, somebody here, folks here in Chicago probably know very well, or knew very well. So I think there's 2 things. I mean, one, he starts off his career really dealing with structuralism and trying to deal with really the unconscious way that culture is transmitted. Right? And so when people see structuralism, like, it's kind of an iron cage, dude. Like, how are you talking about agency and structuralism in the same sentence? And so this is one of the reasons why I use the term structural agency, because by the time we get to, so when you look at his early work that's in structural anthropology, he's really, or that gets anthologized in structural anthropology, he's really concerned with dealing with things on a social structural level. So the reason why the bricoleur becomes interesting is by the time he turns the corner and it starts dealing with the savage mind, he's using a contrasting figure. The bricoleur contrasts to the engineer. The engineer really does things in the typical rule-following way, logical way that he actually comes to critique about the West in the way that it approaches decision making. And what he found really inspiring was what these bricoleurs were doing, or folks he called bricoleurs, who weren't following those rules, or weren't dealing with that at all. And I, along with actually this Christopher Johnson's helped me kind of deal with this, see that there's this second stream in him that is really actually concerned with agency on the individual level. And it's not that stream that shines forward when you're studying Levi-Strauss for bricolage. You get what's called the structural dope. The agent that's in there actually is being worked on by the world, isn't doing anything to the world. When you start looking at this stuff, building from Tris Tropiques and his kind of his ethnographic stuff, and start looking at the Savage Mind, a new character kind of comes on the scene. And it's that newer character in the shape of the bricolage that really is answering some of the questions about agency that were frankly brought up to him in the 40s, right, in New York. That really, I believe, becomes kind of his answer to the question about agency within a structural system. And for that reason, I also think this is what it would make sense then that would be a character that the entrepreneurship literature would attach to, because in a lot of ways it's writing against the corporate literature. So it's looking once again for the same places for freedom in light of the mainstream economic institutions. So I appreciate the sensitivity about the question of agency within structuralism, but I do think that there is at least a reading that says that Levi-Strauss was very aware of this, and that the piece in Levi-Strauss that the entrepreneurship literature is attaching to is really his own answer to that question. It builds off his own answer to that question.
All right, well, thank you.
Thanks.